It's true that the past has a hold on every one of us, but there are those for whom history is a constant preoccupation. And over the coming weeks on Hindsight, we're going to hear from a selection of historians about what interests them and what keeps them going. We start today with Richard White. He's been teaching Australian history at Sydney University for over 20 years, with a specialist interest in the history of holidays and travel. He's speaking with Jennifer Bowen.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi. Nice to see you.
It really was only once I was at university that I really started being attracted to history as a way of thinking and as a discipline. I imagined that I was most interested in English literature, but really the literature that I was interested in was literature within a historical context. And I started to realise, by about my second year, that actually you could do the sorts of things I was interested in doing with literature in the history department.
You were saying, an interest in an historical or a history-inspired way of thinking. What do you mean by that?
I suppose, one of the things I'm interested in is the way we are the products of a past. So I'm interested in the sort of process of change and what brings about change. But it's also looking at the world, thinking about it in terms of historical processes of change and why are things like they are now, when they weren't like that in the past and when we know they won't be like that in the future. And so I think history does develop a way of thinking about the world, not as a static, not as things being as they are because that's the way they're supposed to be or anything. It's recognising that the world is what it is as a result of historical forces and that will continue to change, and understanding those processes of change is not only a sort of really intellectually stimulating exercise, but politically, is a sort of really important understanding to have.
I wonder what or perhaps who got you particularly interested in Australian history?
I suppose actually two people I think have influenced me considerably, and one was Ken Cable, who was a lecturer at Sydney University. He was a historian of the Anglican Church, really, and he wasn't terribly well published, but he was a fabulous lecturer. He made Australian history rich to me, and I think that was a revelation that, what was going on in Australia could be as rich and interesting culturally as anything happening anywhere else, because I think it's a common thing for students to sort of move through school and come to the conclusion by the end of year 12 that Australian history is fairly straightforward and for younger students, but the real sort of sophisticated stuff happens in Europe. And it's that revelation that actually Australian history is as rich and interesting and exciting and as complicated, that's right, as anything else, came from him. And the other one was Ian Turner, who was at Monash University when I went there for 4 years. You couldn't have two more different people, because Ian Turner was ex-Communist Party and very much a sort of radical historian. He began his history career in a sort of traditional labour history, looking at trade union activity, radical activity and some political activity, but then moved increasingly to looking at culture, popular culture, and he did books on sport and on children's playground rhymes and things like that, recognising the need to add to an interest in society, an interest in culture as well, and recognising the interrelationship between the two.
When you say culture, what does that mean? Do you include in that?
Everything. I've sort of argued somewhere that over time, different forms of history come to take on universalist element. So in the 60s it was social history. That covered everything, and everything was understood through the eyes of society. By the 80s and 90s, I think, to some extent, cultural history took on that. But culture, I suppose, is all the things we take for granted, all the ways in which we think about the world we're in, so that those ways of thinking themselves become a force in history. Our understanding of the world is part of and a major influence on what happens in history. Before social history, of course, it was political history. But if you look at, some of the great political historians and then the social historians and then the cultural historians, they're often, in a way, really still interested in a holistic approach to the past, but just seeing it through a different lens.
What's involved in writing history? I mean, obviously you've got to research something, you've got to have evidence for it and so on, just as a scientist would conduct an experiment and have findings and so on. But is it writing up, or is it, in some sense, perhaps more a creative exercise?
Well, I certainly think that distinction between writing up and writing is important. I mean, scientists, yes, all the sort of creative work is in the experiment and so on. I think with historians, there's certainly a lot of creative work in thinking about the questions and pursuing the research, what kinds of research and so on can you choose to do, can be quite creative. But then the writing about it is also a creative exercise. And I sort of always I sort of always tell students that, history is the most literary of disciplines and far more literary as a discipline than, say, literary studies, because the writing process is so important. And I use the example that history is the only discipline that could conceivably always begin with once upon a time. And that is the classic storytelling opening. And the reason for that is within that phrase, once upon a time, what the classic story is telling you is that something happened once and that it changed over time, right? And I think that's the sort of great value of history, that history looks at the particular as well as the general. It's not sociological. It's not just looking for general principles, because history is as interested in the particular as it is in the general. And it's in that interrelationship between the particular and the general, I think, that good history writing emerges, just as it does in a novel.
Taking holidays as subject for historical work, did you not get a few jokes about that?
I once went for a job and the first question was, to put me at ease, why was I interested in such trivial aspects of history? But something like holidays, it's often through what can look like the trivial that we can get into ways of thinking and the ways in which we understand the world. Now, I think looking at holidays, it was about the work-life balance in Australian history. And that's, something that is absolutely crucial. You can't have holidays if you don't have work. In Aboriginal culture as well, what are the implications of work and leisure, and how have we historically worked out that relationship and what's happening to it now? Why, for really over a century, from the 1850s, Australians worked to reduce their hours of work, got weekends, got 1 week's paid holiday, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, up until the 1970s, and nothing has changed since then. And that's something that is not discussed really in our political culture today. And I think, it's an absolutely fascinating historical development.
Associate Professor Richard White from Sydney Uni, speaking with Jennifer Bowen.